The silence in the mahogany-paneled conference room was deafening as the family lawyer cleared his throat and adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. My cousins sat straight-backed in their designer suits. My aunts clutched their expensive handbags, tighter, and my parents exchanged knowing glances that screamed, "Finally, Sarah will learn her place." I slouched in the uncomfortable leather chair, wearing my thrift store cardigan and wondering why I'd even bothered to show up to Grandma Rose's will reading when everyone already knew I'd be getting nothing. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. To my beloved granddaughter, Sarah Mitchell, the lawyer began, and I felt my stomach drop, who has shown me what true courage looks like by following her heart instead of family expectations. I leave my entire estate, including the Victorian mansion on Maple Street, all investment portfolios, the antique jewelry collection, and the sum of $4.7 million. The gasps that followed could have sucked all the oxygen from the room. My cousin Jennifer's face went white as marble. My Uncle Robert's mouth hung open like a broken gate, and my mother actually dropped her purse, spilling its contents across the Persian rug. But it was my father's expression that I'll never forget. Pure, undiluted shock mixed with something that looked suspiciously like fear. That moment in the lawyer's office represents the culmination of 28 years of being the family disappointment, the black sheep, the one who never quite measured up to the Mitchell family standards. But to understand how sweet that victory tasted, you need to know how bitter the journey had been. You need to understand what it feels like to grow up in a family where love comes with conditions and acceptance requires conformity to a narrow definition of success. My story begins in the sprawling suburbs of Millbrook Heights, where the Mitchell family had been pillars of the community for 3 generations. The Mitchells weren't just wealthy, they were old money, the kind of family that had streets named after them and wings in the local hospital bearing their name. My grandfather had built a real estate empire that my father expanded into commercial development, and every Mitchell child was expected to carry on the legacy of respectability, financial success, and social prominence. I was born the youngest of 3 children to Margaret and William Mitchell, arriving 10 years after my sister Caroline and 8 years after my brother Thomas. By the time I came along, the family dynamics were already well established. Caroline was the golden child, beautiful, accomplished, destined for greatness. She excelled at everything she touched, from piano recitals to academic achievements, and had inherited our mother's grace and our father's business acumen. Thomas was the heir apparent, groomed from birth to take over the family business, with the kind of natural charisma that made him popular with everyone from country club members to construction workers. Then there was me, Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell, the unexpected late addition who never quite fit the mold. From my earliest memories, I was different. While Caroline practiced piano in our grand living room, I was outside in Grandma Rose's garden, helping her plant vegetables and learning the names of wildflowers. While Thomas studied business principles and attended junior golf tournaments, I was curled up in the library, reading fantasy novels and writing stories in composition notebooks. I hid under my bed. My parents tolerated these quirks when I was young, assuming I'd eventually grow out of my artistic phase and embrace the family values of achievement and status. Grandma Rose was the only one who seemed to understand me. She lived in the original family home, a beautiful Victorian mansion that had been in our family for over a century. While the rest of the family had moved to the newer, more fashionable neighborhoods, Grandma Rose had refused to leave the house where she'd raised her children and created her most precious memories. Every weekend, I'd escape to her place, where she'd teach me to bake bread from scratch, show me how to tend her magnificent garden, and listen to my stories with genuine interest and encouragement. "Sarah, dear," she'd tell me as we sat on her wraparound porch watching the sunset, "success isn't about how much money you make or how many people know your name. It's about living authentically and making a positive difference in the world. Don't let anyone convince you that your worth is measured by their standards." But Grandma Rose's wisdom felt increasingly isolated as I grew older, and the family pressure intensified. My parents enrolled me in the same prestigious private academy that Caroline and Thomas had attended, expecting me to excel in the traditional subjects that would prepare me for a respectable career in business or law. Instead, I struggled with mathematics and science while flourishing in English and art classes. My report cards became sources of family tension, with my parents scheduling conferences with teachers and hiring tutors to help me reach my potential. The comparisons to my siblings were constant and crushing. "Why can't you be more like Caroline?" my mother would ask when I received a B- in calculus. "Thomas never had trouble with organization," my father would comment when my room was messy or I forgot to complete some household responsibility. These comparisons weren't intended to be cruel, but they communicated a clear message. I was falling short of family expectations, and my natural inclinations were somehow wrong or insufficient. High school brought new challenges as my differences became more pronounced. While Caroline was homecoming queen and valedictorian, I was writing for the school newspaper and participating in drama club. While Thomas was captain of the debate team and student body president, I was organizing environmental awareness campaigns and volunteering at the local animal shelter. My extracurricular activities were dismissed as nice hobbies that wouldn't look impressive on college applications or contribute to a serious career. The breaking point came during my junior year when I announced my intention to study creative writing in college. The family dinner where I shared this news remains one of the most painful memories of my adolescence. We were seated around our formal dining room table, the chandelier casting elegant light on the fine china and crystal glasses that represented everything the Mitchell family valued about tradition and refinement. "Creative writing?" my father repeated, setting down his fork with deliberate precision. "Sarah, that's not a career. That's a hobby. You need to think about your future seriously." "It is serious, Dad," I replied, my voice already wavering despite my determination to stand firm. "I want to be a novelist. I've been working on a manuscript, and my English teacher thinks I have real talent." My mother exchanged a look with my father before speaking in the carefully modulated tone she used when discussing unpleasant topics. "Sweetheart, writing is a lovely skill to have, but it's not practical. What would you do for money? How would you support yourself? The Mitchell family has a reputation to maintain." Caroline, who was home from her sophomore year at Harvard Business School, joined the conversation with the authority of someone already succeeding in acceptable career paths. "Sarah, you're being naive. Do you know how few people actually make a living as writers? You need to choose something stable and respectable. What about journalism? At least that's a real job." Thomas, ever the pragmatist, attempted to find middle ground. "Why don't you major in business with a minor in English? That way you have something to fall back on when the writing thing doesn't work out." The phrase, "when the writing thing doesn't work out," hit me like a physical blow. Not if it didn't work out, but when. They had already decided I would fail before I'd even tried. "I don't want to fall back on anything," I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to remain calm. "I want to pursue what I'm passionate about. I want to tell stories that matter, that help people understand themselves and the world better." My father's response was swift and final. "If you insist on pursuing this impractical dream, you'll do it without family financial support. The Mitchell name has been built on sound business decisions and practical career choices. I won't enable a fantasy that will only lead to disappointment and embarrassment." The ultimatum was clear: conform to family expectations or face financial and emotional exile. For a 17-year-old who had never lived outside the protective bubble of family wealth and privilege, the threat was terrifying. But something deep inside me, perhaps inherited from Grandma Rose's stubborn independence, refused to surrender my dreams for the sake of family approval. That night, I walked to Grandma Rose's house through the tree-lined streets of our neighborhood, tears streaming down my face as I replayed the dinner conversation. I found her in her kitchen, preparing her nightly cup of chamomile tea, and collapsed into her arms with all the dramatic emotion of a heartbroken teenager. "They don't understand me, Grandma," I sobbed into her shoulder. "They think my dreams are stupid and worthless. They want me to be someone I'm not." Grandma Rose held me tight, stroking my hair the way she had when I was a small child afraid of thunderstorms. "Oh, my dear girl," she murmured. "Your dreams are neither stupid nor worthless. They're part of what makes you special, what makes you you. Don't let fear or family pressure convince you to abandon what brings you joy." "But they're threatening to cut off college funding if I don't choose a practical major," I explained through my tears. "How can I pursue writing without their support? I don't have any money of my own." Grandma Rose pulled back to look at me directly, her blue eyes fierce with determination. "There are always options, Sarah. Scholarships, student loans, work-study, programs. Yes, it will be harder without family money, but it's not impossible. The question is, what kind of person do you want to be? Someone who compromises her authentic self for security, or someone who has the courage to pursue her truth regardless of the obstacles?" Her words planted a seed of determination that would sustain me through the difficult years ahead. That night, lying in my childhood bedroom surrounded by participation trophies and academic awards that had never brought me genuine satisfaction, I made a decision that would alter the trajectory of my life. I would pursue creative writing in college, with or without family support. The next morning, I informed my parents of my decision. My father's face turned red with frustration, while my mother began crying about my throwing away every advantage they had provided. Caroline shook her head in disapproval, and Thomas tried once more to convince me to reconsider, but I had crossed a line from which there was no return. "Fine," my father said finally, his voice cold with disappointment. "But don't come running back when reality hits and you realize you've made a terrible mistake. And don't expect us to bail you out when you can't pay your bills or maintain the lifestyle you've grown accustomed to." The months leading up to my high school graduation were tense and uncomfortable. My parents continued to provide basic necessities, but the emotional warmth that had once characterized our family relationships had evaporated. They spoke to me with polite distance, as if I were a houseguest they were eager to see leave. Caroline and Thomas followed their lead, treating me with the kind of cordial indifference typically reserved for acquaintances rather than siblings. Only Grandma Rose remained constant in her support and affection. She helped me research creative writing programs, assisted with scholarship applications, and provided emotional encouragement when the isolation from my immediate family became overwhelming. Her Victorian mansion became my sanctuary, a place where I could be myself without judgment or pressure to conform to expectations that felt foreign to my nature. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "You're braver than you know, Sarah," she told me one afternoon as we worked together in her garden, our hands dirty from planting tomatoes and herbs. "It takes tremendous courage to choose authenticity over approval, especially when the approval comes from people you love, but you'll never regret following your heart, even if the path is more challenging." I was accepted to Riverside University's creative writing program with a partial scholarship that, combined with student loans and a work-study job, would make my education financially feasible without family assistance. The acceptance letter felt like validation that my dreams weren't as impractical as my family believed, and for the first time in months, I felt hopeful about my future. My graduation from Millbrook Heights Academy was a bittersweet affair. My parents attended, fulfilling their social obligations to appear supportive, but their smiles were forced and their congratulations felt hollow. Caroline and Thomas were there as well, maintaining the family image of unity while privately disapproving of my choices. After the ceremony, other families gathered for celebratory dinners and gift exchanges, but my parents simply drove me home in silence. That evening, As I packed my belongings for the transition to college life, Grandma Rose knocked on my bedroom door. She entered carrying a small wrapped package and wearing the gentle smile that had comforted me throughout my childhood. "This is for you, dear," she said, handing me the gift. "Something to remind you that you're loved and supported, even when the path gets difficult." Inside the wrapping was a vintage fountain pen, its silver surface engraved with delicate roses and my initials. "It belonged to my grandmother," Grandma Rose explained. "She was a teacher who believed in the power of words to change the world. I think she would have loved knowing it was passed on to another writer in the family." I held the pen carefully, understanding that I was receiving more than a beautiful object. This was a tangible connection to family history that had nothing to do with business success or social status, but everything to do with passion, creativity, and the courage to pursue meaningful work. "Thank you, Grandma," I whispered, tears threatening to spill over once again. "This means everything to me." "You mean everything to me, Sarah," she replied, pulling me into another of her encompassing hugs. "Don't let anyone convince you that your dreams are too small or too impractical. The world needs storytellers, people who can help others understand life's complexities and beauty. You have that gift." The summer before college passed quickly, filled with my part-time job at a local bookstore and writing sessions in Grandma Rose's garden. My parents maintained their emotional distance, treating my impending departure for college as if I were moving abroad permanently rather than attending a university just 3 hours away. The message was clear. By choosing my own path, I had chosen to separate myself from the family unit. Moving day arrived with late August heat and humidity that made the loading of my modest possessions feel like a marathon event. My parents helped carry boxes to the car, but their assistance felt obligatory rather than loving. There were no last-minute expressions of pride or encouragement, no promises to visit or invitations to come home soon. Caroline and Thomas had convenient conflicts that prevented them from participating in my send-off, a pattern that would continue throughout my college years. Only Grandma Rose embraced me with genuine emotion, holding me tight and whispering words of encouragement in my ear. "Write beautiful stories, my dear girl," she said, "and remember that you always have a home here with me." As we drove toward Riverside University, I watched the familiar landmarks of my childhood disappear in the rearview mirror. The country club where I'd attended countless family events, the private school where I'd struggled to fit in, the neighborhood streets where I'd felt increasingly isolated. All of it was being left behind as I moved toward an uncertain but authentic future. My parents dropped me off at my dormitory with minimal fanfare. They helped carry my belongings to my room, met my roommate briefly, and prepared to leave within an hour of arriving. My mother kissed my cheek with the same perfunctory affection. She might show a distant relative, while my father shook my hand formally and reminded me that I had made my choice and would need to live with the consequences. Standing in my small dorm room after they departed, surrounded by the few possessions that represented my transition to independence, I felt simultaneously liberated and terrified. For the first time in my life, I was free to pursue my passions, without family judgment or pressure, but I was also more alone than I'd ever been. College life at Riverside proved to be everything I had hoped for and more challenging than I'd anticipated. The creative writing program was rigorous and competitive, filled with talented students who shared my passion for storytelling, but brought diverse perspectives and experiences I'd never encountered in the privileged bubble of Millbrook Heights. My professors pushed me to explore difficult themes and experiment with different narrative techniques, helping me develop skills that went far beyond the basic writing I'd done in high school. Financially, life was a constant struggle that my wealthy classmates couldn't relate to. While they complained about dorm food and talked casually about spring break trips to Europe, I was working 20 hours a week in the campus bookstore, carefully budgeting every dollar and eating ramen noodles for dinner more nights than I cared to count. The contrast between my current lifestyle and the comfort I'd grown up with was stark and sometimes demoralizing. But there were unexpected joys in this simpler existence. I discovered that I was more resourceful and resilient than I'd ever imagined. I learned to find entertainment in free campus events rather than expensive restaurants and shows. I formed friendships based on shared interests and genuine compatibility, rather than social status or family connections. For the first time in my life, people knew me for who I was, rather than whose daughter I was. My relationship with my family continued to deteriorate during my college years. Phone calls home were infrequent and awkward, filled with surface-level questions about classes and weather while avoiding any meaningful discussion of my major or career aspirations. When I did share exciting news about writing achievements, winning a campus poetry contest, having a short story published in the literary magazine, receiving praise from professors, my family's responses were politely dismissive. "That's nice, dear," my mother would say in the same tone she might use to acknowledge a neighbor's garden. "How are your other classes going?" Caroline and Thomas were too busy with their own successful trajectories to maintain regular contact. Caroline had graduated from Harvard and was working at a prestigious consulting firm in Boston, while Thomas had completed his MBA and joined my father's company as a junior executive. Their careers were progressing exactly as the family had expected, earning them praise and pride that I would never receive for my writing achievements. Holiday visits home became increasingly uncomfortable affairs. I would arrive to find my family continuing their lives without apparent recognition of my absence, as if I were a peripheral character rather than a central family member. Conversations at dinner would focus on Caroline's latest promotion or Thomas's successful client presentations, while my academic achievements or writing progress were ignored or mentioned only briefly before the discussion moved to more important topics. The guest room where I stayed during these visits felt temporary and unwelcoming, decorated with generic hotel-style furniture rather than personal touches that might indicate this was still my home. My childhood bedroom had been converted into my mother's home office, erasing the last physical evidence of my place in the family structure. Only Grandma Rose remained a source of unconditional love and support throughout these years. I visited her whenever I was in town, sharing my latest writing projects and listening to her stories about family history and local community news. She had maintained my bedroom in her Victorian mansion exactly as I'd left it during my frequent childhood visits, creating a space that felt more like home than anywhere else. During one particularly difficult sophomore year visit, when my family had been especially cold and dismissive, I broke down in Grandma Rose's kitchen and confessed my growing doubts about my chosen path. "Maybe they're right," I sobbed, exhausted from 2 years of financial struggle and emotional isolation. "Maybe I'm being impractical and stubborn. Maybe I should transfer to business school and try to rebuild my relationship with the family." Grandma Rose listened patiently as I poured out my frustrations and fears, then took my hands in her weathered but strong ones. "Sarah, dear, let me tell you something about your family that you might not understand yet. They love you, but they're afraid of anything they can't control or predict. Your creativity and independence threaten their sense of how the world should work." She paused, looking out the window at the garden we had tended together for so many years. "But being true to yourself isn't about making other people comfortable. It's about becoming the person you're meant to be, even if that person doesn't fit into existing expectations. Your writing has power and beauty that the world needs. Don't abandon it because your family can't see its value." Her words gave me the strength to continue pursuing my dreams despite the ongoing family disapproval. I returned to school with renewed determination, throwing myself into my writing with increased passion and dedication. By my junior year, I had developed a distinctive voice that my professors praised and my peers respected. I was elected editor of the literary magazine and had several pieces accepted for publication in respected journals. But the family dynamics remained unchanged. When I called home excited about winning a National Collegiate Writing Award, my mother's response was tepid. "That's wonderful, dear. Your father and I are flying to Boston this weekend to see Caroline's new apartment. She's been promoted to senior consultant." The implicit message was clear. While I was winning prizes for my writing, Caroline was achieving real success in the real world. My accomplishments, no matter how significant within my field, would never be considered equivalent to traditional markers of professional advancement. During my senior year, as I prepared for graduation and faced the daunting prospect of launching a writing career in an uncertain market, the emotional distance from my family became even more pronounced. They began discussing my post-graduation plans as if they were discussing a problem to be solved rather than a young woman's excited transition to professional life. "We've spoken with Robert Henderson at the bank," my father announced during a particularly uncomfortable family dinner. "He said they'd be willing to consider you for their management training program if you're ready to be sensible about your future." "I'm not interested in banking," I replied firmly. "I'm planning to move to the city and freelance while working on my novel." The silence that followed was deafening. Caroline shook her head in dismay, while Thomas cleared his throat uncomfortably. My mother looked as if I had announced plans to join a circus. "Sarah," my father said finally, his voice heavy with disappointment, "you're 22 years old. It's time to stop playing and start building a real life. This writing fantasy has gone on long enough." "It's not a fantasy," I insisted, feeling the familiar combination of hurt and determination that had sustained me through 4 years of family disapproval. "I've had work published. I've received recognition from professors and professionals in the field. This is my career, not a game." My mother attempted a gentler approach, but her words carried the same underlying message. "Sweetheart, we just worry about your future. Writing is such an uncertain field. What if you can't make ends meet? What if you never get published? Wouldn't it be wiser to have something stable to rely on?" Their concerns weren't entirely unreasonable, but they were delivered without faith in my abilities or acknowledgement of my achievements. They spoke as if failure was inevitable rather than success being possible, as if my years of dedicated study and practice had taught me nothing valuable. That night, I called Grandma Rose from my dorm room, crying with frustration and hurt. "They act like I'm throwing my life away," I told her. "They can't see that this is the only thing that's ever made me truly happy, the only thing I've ever been really good at." "Oh, my dear," Grandma Rose said softly, "they're looking at your life through the lens of their own fears and limitations. But you're not limited by their vision. You have gifts they don't understand, and that makes them uncomfortable. Don't let their discomfort become your prison." Graduation day arrived with spring weather that made the campus look like a postcard. My parents attended the ceremony, fulfilling their social obligations while maintaining emotional distance. They took the required photographs and attended the reception, but their pride seemed forced and their smiles strained. Other families were celebrating their children's achievements with obvious joy and excitement, while mine seemed to be enduring an obligation. After the ceremony, as other families made plans for celebratory dinners and extended visits, my parents prepared to return home immediately. "We need to get back for your brother's presentation to the board tomorrow," my mother explained, as if this provided adequate justification for their hasty departure. "Congratulations, Sarah," my father said, shaking my hand with the same formality. He might show a business acquaintance. "I hope you'll reconsider our conversation about practical career options." Caroline and Thomas had not attended the graduation, both citing work conflicts that prevented them from participating in what should have been a significant family milestone. Their absence spoke louder than any words could have about my place in the family hierarchy. Only Grandma Rose celebrated my achievement with genuine enthusiasm and pride. She had arrived early, stayed for the entire day, and treated my graduation as the momentous occasion it was. "I'm so proud of you, Sarah," she said, her eyes bright with tears of joy. You've accomplished something remarkable by staying true to yourself despite all the pressure to conform." As my family prepared to leave, Grandma Rose pulled me aside for a private moment. "I want you to know that I believe in you completely," she said, pressing a small envelope into my hands. "This is to help you get started in the city. It's not much, but it's given with love and faith in your future." Inside the envelope was a check for $5,000, an amount that represented significant financial sacrifice for someone living on a fixed retirement income. But more than the money, it was the gesture of support and belief that moved me to tears. "I can't take this, Grandma," I protested. "You need this money for yourself." "Nonsense," she replied firmly. "This is an investment in your dreams, and I can't think of a better use for my savings. Promise me you'll use it to give yourself time to write, to really pursue your passion without worrying about immediate financial survival." That evening, after my family had departed and other students were celebrating with friends and relatives, I sat alone in my empty dorm room, contemplating the uncertain future ahead. In a few days, I would move to a small apartment in the city, armed with my degree, my grandmother's financial gift, and the determination to prove that my family's lack of faith had been misplaced. The path ahead was daunting and unclear, but for the first time in my life, it was entirely my own to choose. No family expectations to meet, no traditional definitions of success to conform to, no one else's vision of my future to fulfill. I was free to discover what I was truly capable of achieving when unencumbered by others' limitations and fears. As I packed my belongings for the final time, carefully wrapping the fountain pen Grandma Rose had given me years earlier, I felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation about what lay ahead. The girl who had once been the family disappointment was about to discover what she could become when she stopped trying to be anyone other than herself. The city air tasted like freedom and exhaust fumes as I stepped off the bus with 2 suitcases and a backpack containing everything I owned. My new apartment was a 4th-floor walk-up in a neighborhood that real estate agents euphemistically called emerging, which meant it was affordable for someone with my limited budget and questionable financial prospects. The building was old enough to have character and young enough to have functioning plumbing, though the radiator clanged like a percussion orchestra every morning at dawn. My studio apartment measured roughly 300 square feet, with a kitchenette that could charitably be described as compact, and a bathroom so small that I had to step into the hallway to change my mind. But it was mine, paid for with Grandma Rose's gift and a part-time job I'd secured at a local coffee shop. And for the first time in my life, every decision about how to arrange the space reflected my own preferences rather than family expectations. I positioned my writing desk by the single large window that overlooked a courtyard where pigeons congregated and neighbors hung laundry on fire escapes. The morning light was perfect for writing, and I could watch the rhythm of city life while crafting stories about characters who, like me, were trying to figure out who they were meant to become. My fountain pen sat in a place of honor on the desk, a daily reminder of Grandma Rose's faith in my dreams and my commitment to honoring that faith through dedicated work. The transition to independent adult life proved more challenging than I had anticipated during my optimistic college planning sessions. While I had intellectually understood that pursuing a writing career would involve financial uncertainty, the reality of tracking every expense and calculating whether I could afford both groceries and electricity in the same week was emotionally exhausting. My coffee shop job provided enough income to cover basic necessities, but left little room for the small luxuries I had unconsciously taken for granted throughout my privileged childhood. Those first months in the city were a masterclass in creative resourcefulness. I learned to shop at discount grocery stores and farmers markets closing sales, to cook simple meals that could stretch across multiple days, and to find entertainment in free museums, library events, and outdoor concerts rather than expensive restaurants and theater productions. My wardrobe consisted of thrift store finds and college clothing that I mended and altered to extend their useful life. But there was unexpected joy in this simplified existence. I discovered that I was more capable and resilient than I had ever imagined during my cushioned upbringing. Every small accomplishment, from successfully fixing a leaky faucet to stretching my grocery budget through creative meal planning, felt like evidence of my growing competence and independence. I was learning to rely on myself in ways that would have been impossible if I had remained financially dependent on my family. My work schedule at the coffee shop was deliberately structured to protect my writing time. I opened the shop at 6 in the morning, serving commuters and early risers their daily caffeine fix, then finished my shift by early afternoon. This arrangement left my evenings free for writing, when my creative energy was strongest and the city had settled into its quieter rhythms. I wrote every day without exception, treating my fiction like the serious profession I intended it to become rather than a hobby to pursue when convenient. The customers at the coffee shop provided unexpected inspiration for my writing. I served stressed executives grabbing quick fuel between meetings, artists discussing their latest projects over elaborate specialty drinks, elderly couples sharing quiet conversations over simple black coffee, and students cramming for exams while consuming dangerous amounts of caffeine. Their conversations, body language, and interactions became raw material for the characters and situations I was developing in my stories. My manager, Elena, was a former theater major who had taken the coffee shop job as a temporary measure while auditioning for acting roles. Like me, she was pursuing an artistic career while working in the service industry, and we formed a friendship based on shared experiences of following creative dreams despite practical challenges. Elena understood the delicate balance between earning enough money to survive and preserving enough energy and time for artistic work. The secret, Elena told me during a quiet afternoon shift, is remembering that this job is funding your real work, not defining your identity. Some people get stuck thinking they are what they do for money, but we're writers and actors who happen to make coffee to pay the bills. Her perspective helped me maintain dignity and purpose during the more difficult aspects of service work. When customers were rude or dismissive, when my feet ached from standing all day, when I felt exhausted and questioned whether I was making progress toward my goals, Elena's reminder that I was an artist supporting my craft kept me focused on the larger picture. My writing during those early months in the city reflected the emotional and financial challenges I was navigating. The stories I produced were grittier and more realistic than the somewhat idealistic fiction I had written. In college, characters struggled with economic uncertainty, family disappointment, and the gap between their dreams and their daily reality. My professors had often encouraged students to write what you know, and I was discovering that my knowledge now included experiences far outside my privileged background. One story that emerged during this period focused on a young woman who had been disowned by her wealthy family for pursuing art instead of business. The protagonist worked multiple jobs while creating sculptures in her cramped apartment, transforming discarded materials into beautiful art that reflected both her creativity and her resourcefulness. The story explored themes of identity, authenticity, and the courage required to choose meaning over security. I submitted this story to several literary magazines, understanding that rejection was a normal part of the publication process, but hoping that my work had developed enough sophistication to merit acceptance somewhere. The rejections that arrived were form letters, polite but impersonal, offering no specific feedback about how I might improve my craft. But I had learned enough about the publishing industry to know that even established writers faced frequent rejection, and I refused to interpret these responses as evidence that my family had been right about the impracticality of my chosen career. My relationship with my family during this period consisted of occasional, stilted phone conversations that felt more like obligation than genuine connection. My parents would ask superficial questions about my living situation and work, clearly hoping I would admit failure and request assistance returning to a more conventional path. When I shared positive news about my writing progress or small achievements, their responses were politely dismissive, as if they were humoring a child's fantasy, rather than acknowledging legitimate professional development. "That's nice, dear," my mother would say when I mentioned having a story accepted by a small literary journal. "Are you still working at that coffee place? It must be difficult to make ends meet." The subtext was always present. When I was ready to admit that my artistic pursuits were unsustainable, they would welcome me back into the family fold, presumably with appropriate gratitude for their wisdom and forgiveness for my stubborn rebellion. But the financial and emotional independence I was gradually building made their approval seem less necessary and their conditional love less appealing. Caroline and Thomas maintained their distance, occasionally sending brief messages through our parents, but never reaching out directly. Their lives had continued to progress along expected trajectories, with Caroline receiving promotions at her consulting firm and Thomas taking on increased responsibilities in my father's business. Their success was frequently mentioned during family phone calls, not necessarily to make me feel inadequate, but certainly with the effect of highlighting the contrast between their stable prosperity and my uncertain circumstances. Only Grandma, Rose, remained a source of unconditional support and genuine interest in my life and work. We spoke every week, long conversations where she listened to my struggles and celebrated my small victories with equal attention and enthusiasm. She never suggested that I should reconsider my career choice or implied that my challenges were evidence of poor decision-making. Instead, she offered practical advice about budgeting and city living, emotional support during difficult periods, and consistent faith in my eventual success. "Every worthwhile dream requires sacrifice and persistence," she told me during one particularly challenging period when I was questioning whether I had the strength to continue pursuing such an uncertain career. "The people who succeed are not necessarily the most talented, but the ones who refuse to give up when things get difficult. You have both talent and determination, Sarah. Don't let temporary hardships convince you that your path is wrong." Her words sustained me through the inevitable moments of doubt and discouragement that accompanied the early stages of building a creative career. When rejection letters accumulated and my bank account dwindled, when I felt isolated from my family and uncertain about my future, Grandma Rose's unwavering belief in my abilities reminded me why I had chosen this difficult but authentic path. As my first year in the city progressed, I began to establish routines and connections that made my new life feel more stable and sustainable. I found a community of other writers through open mic nights at bookstores and literary events at the library. These gatherings provided opportunities to share my work, receive feedback from peers, and learn about publishing opportunities and writing contests I might not have discovered otherwise. The other writers I met were pursuing similar paths, balancing artistic work with day jobs, navigating the publishing industry's complexities, and supporting each other through the inevitable challenges of creative careers. Some were older and more established, generous with advice about craft and business aspects of writing. Others were at similar stages of development, eager to form critique groups and collaborative relationships that could benefit everyone involved. Through these connections, I learned about freelance writing opportunities that could supplement my coffee shop income while utilizing my skills more directly. I began taking on projects for local businesses that needed website content, marketing, materials, and newsletter articles. The work was not particularly creative or personally fulfilling, but it paid better than my restaurant job and provided valuable experience in meeting deadlines, working with clients, and adapting my writing style to different purposes and audiences. My fiction writing continued to evolve as I gained more life experience and developed greater technical skill through practice and feedback. The stories I produced during my second year in the city were more sophisticated in their character development and thematic depth. I was learning to trust my voice rather than imitating authors I admired, to find universal themes within specific personal experiences, and to craft narratives that engaged readers while exploring meaningful questions about human nature and society. One breakthrough came when a respected literary magazine accepted a story I had written about family dynamics and the cost of choosing authenticity over approval. The acceptance letter arrived on a gray Tuesday afternoon when I was feeling particularly discouraged about my progress and questioning whether I had the persistence necessary for a writing career. The editor's personal note praising the story's emotional honesty and narrative sophistication felt like validation that my years of dedication and sacrifice were producing measurable improvement in my craft. I called Grandma Rose immediately to share the news, and her joy was so genuine and exuberant that I started crying right there on the sidewalk outside my apartment building. "I knew it, sweetheart," she said, her voice filled with pride and excitement. "I knew your work would find its audience. This is just the beginning of wonderful things to come." The publication credit gave me confidence to submit work to more competitive venues and to apply for writing fellowships and grants that could provide both financial support and professional recognition. I spent hours researching opportunities, crafting application essays, and preparing manuscript samples that represented my best work. The process was time-consuming and often frustrating, but I was learning to view rejection as a normal part of professional development rather than a personal failure. My coffee shop job became a laboratory for observing human behavior and collecting material for future stories. I developed the ability to notice details about customers' interactions, conversations, and emotional states that provided insight into the complexities of urban life and relationships. A businessman who ordered the same elaborate drink every morning but never made eye contact became a character struggling with social anxiety in a story about workplace isolation. An elderly woman who brought her own cup and left generous tips became the inspiration for a piece about dignity and independence in old age. Elena and I were promoted to shift supervisors during my second year, which came with modest pay increases and additional responsibilities that I welcomed as evidence of my growing competence in at least one area of my life. Managing schedules, training new employees, and handling customer complaints required skills that were transferable to other professional contexts, and I began to see my service industry experience as valuable preparation for the business aspects of a writing career. The promotion also provided enough additional income to allow me to reduce my freelance workload and dedicate more time to creative writing. I established a more disciplined schedule, treating my fiction writing like a part-time job with specific hours and productivity goals. This approach helped me complete longer projects and develop the sustained focus necessary for novel-length narratives. During this period, I began working on my first novel, an ambitious project that drew on my experiences with family expectations, financial independence, and the challenges of pursuing creative work in a society that values financial success above artistic achievement. The protagonist was a young woman from a wealthy family who chooses to become a teacher in an underfunded urban school, facing both family disapproval and systemic challenges, while discovering her capacity for making a meaningful difference in her students' lives. The novel required more sustained effort and planning than any writing project I had previously attempted. I spent months developing character backgrounds, plotting narrative arcs, and researching educational issues to ensure authenticity in my portrayal of urban teaching challenges. The work was simultaneously exciting and intimidating, representing both my growing confidence as a writer and my commitment to tackling more complex and socially relevant themes. My third year in the city brought new opportunities and challenges that tested both my professional skills and personal resilience. I was accepted into a competitive writing workshop led by a published novelist whose work I had long admired. The workshop required a significant financial investment that stretched my budget, but the opportunity to receive expert feedback and connect with other serious writers felt essential for my continued development. The workshop experience was both humbling and inspiring. My fellow participants were talented writers from diverse backgrounds, many with publication credits and professional experience that exceeded my own. The instructor was demanding but constructive, pushing all of us to take greater risks in our work and to examine our assumptions about character motivation, narrative structure, and thematic depth. Through the workshop, I learned techniques for revision that transformed my approach to the writing process. Rather than viewing first drafts as nearly complete works requiring only minor editing, I began to understand revision as an opportunity for fundamental discovery and improvement. I learned to separate the creative process of generating material from the analytical process of shaping that material into effective narrative, to seek feedback at appropriate stages of development, and to maintain objectivity about my work, while preserving the emotional authenticity that gave it power. The novel I was developing benefited enormously from the workshop feedback and techniques. Characters became more complex and believable, plot development felt more organic and inevitable, and themes emerged naturally from character actions rather than being imposed artificially by authorial intention. I began to feel like I was writing at a professional level, producing work that could potentially compete for publication with established authors. My relationship with my family remained distant but stable during this period. Phone conversations continued to be brief and superficial, focused on basic life updates rather than meaningful personal sharing. My parents still seemed to be waiting for me to admit failure and request assistance returning to a more conventional career path, while I was increasingly confident that my chosen direction was both sustainable and personally fulfilling. Caroline had married a fellow Harvard MBA and was planning a wedding that, according to family reports, would be featured in society magazines and attended by hundreds of business and social contacts. Thomas had been promoted to vice president in my father's company and was dating a woman from another prominent local family. Their lives continued to progress according to family expectations and social conventions, earning them praise and approval that I would never receive for my writing achievements. But I was beginning to understand that their approval was no longer necessary for my happiness or self-worth. The independence I had built through my own efforts, the artistic growth I had achieved through dedicated practice, and the community I had found among other writers provided fulfillment that was based on my authentic interests and abilities rather than external validation. The contrast between my current life and my privileged upbringing was stark, but not entirely negative. While I had less financial security and material comfort, I had gained self-reliance, creative fulfillment, and the satisfaction of pursuing work that aligned with my values and interests. The skills I had developed through necessity, budgeting, time management, resourcefulness, resilience, were valuable regardless of what career path I ultimately followed. Grandma Rose visited me in the city for the first time during my third year, taking the train from our hometown to see my apartment and experience my daily life firsthand. I was nervous about her reaction to my modest living situation, worried that she might be concerned about my financial circumstances or question whether I was making appropriate progress toward stability and success. But her response exceeded my hopes. She was delighted with my small apartment, praising the way I had arranged the space to maximize both functionality and beauty. She loved the neighborhood's character and diversity, the bustling energy of the streets, and the sense of possibility that seemed to permeate city life. Most importantly, she could see that I was thriving in this environment, that the independence and creative work I had chosen were contributing to my growth and happiness. "You've become exactly who you were meant to be," she told me as we sat in my favorite coffee shop, watching the diverse parade of city dwellers through the large front windows. "I can see the confidence and purpose in you that were always there, but couldn't flourish in the restrictive environment you grew up in. You made the right choice, Sarah, even though it was the difficult choice." We spent 3 days together, during which I showed her my writing workspace, introduced her to Elena and my other friends, and took her to some of the literary events and cultural activities that had become important parts of my life. She met several of my writer friends and was impressed by their dedication to their craft and their mutual support for each other's work. "These are your real people," she observed, after an evening spent at a poetry reading where I had shared one of my newer pieces. "These friends understand and appreciate who you are in ways your family never has. You found your tribe, dear, and that's worth more than all the money and social status in the world." Her visit reinforced my growing sense that I had successfully created a life that reflected my authentic self, rather than family expectations or social conventions. While my path had required sacrifices and continued to involve uncertainty, it had led to genuine happiness and creative fulfillment that would have been impossible if I had chosen security over authenticity. During my 4th year in the city, my writing career began to gain real momentum. I had accumulated several publication credits in respected literary magazines, had been awarded a small grant for emerging writers, and had completed the first draft of my novel. More importantly, I had developed the professional skills and personal confidence necessary to navigate the publishing industry effectively. I found a literary agent who was interested in representing my novel, a significant milestone that felt like validation of my years of work and sacrifice. The agent was experienced in literary fiction and had successfully placed books with major publishers. She provided valuable feedback about revisions that would make my manuscript more competitive, and she helped me develop a more sophisticated understanding of the business aspects of publishing. The revision process was intensive but rewarding, requiring me to examine every aspect of my novel with critical objectivity, while preserving the emotional authenticity that made the story compelling. I worked with my agent and a freelance editor to strengthen character development, tighten plot structure, and refine the prose style. The process taught me more about the craft of writing than I had learned through any other single experience. While my agent submitted my revised novel to publishers, I continued working on new short fiction and planning my next book-length project. The waiting period was anxious but productive, as I had learned to view each project as part of a larger body of work rather than betting everything on a single manuscript's success. My coffee shop job had evolved into a management position that provided better pay and more regular hours, allowing me to reduce my freelance work and focus more intensively on creative writing. Elena and I had developed the shop into a popular community gathering place that hosted poetry readings, book clubs, and other literary events. These activities brought me into contact with established writers, editors, and literary agents who provided valuable professional connections and opportunities. The community I had built in the city felt increasingly like family, based on shared values and mutual support rather than blood relationships or social obligations. My writer friends celebrated each other's successes, provided encouragement during difficult periods, and offered honest feedback that helped everyone improve their craft. These relationships felt more authentic and nurturing than the conditional approval I had received from my biological family. My phone conversations with my parents had become even more infrequent and superficial as my life diverged further from their expectations and understanding. They would ask basic questions about my health and living situation, but showed little interest in my writing progress or professional development. When I mentioned my agent or publication credits, their responses suggested that they viewed these achievements as interesting hobbies rather than legitimate career advancement. Caroline and Thomas remained distant, their lives proceeding according to predictable patterns of professional advancement and social conformity. Caroline's wedding had been, by all accounts, a spectacular society event that reinforced her family's prominence and business connections. Thomas was being groomed for eventual leadership of my father's company and was considering running for local political office. Their successes continued to be celebrated and discussed during family gatherings I no longer attended. Only Grandma Rose remained consistently interested in my life and supportive of my choices. Our weekly phone conversations were highlights of my week, opportunities to share my struggles and victories with someone who understood their significance and celebrated my progress. She had become my primary family connection, the person who knew me best and loved me most unconditionally. During one of our conversations in my 4th year, Grandma Rose mentioned that she had been feeling more tired than usual and had scheduled some medical appointments to investigate potential health issues. She downplayed the significance of these concerns, describing them as routine checkups that her doctor recommended, but something in her tone suggested that she was more worried than she wanted to admit. "I'm sure it's nothing serious," she assured me when I expressed concern. "Just the normal aches and pains of getting older. But I wanted you to know in case the doctors find something that requires treatment. I don't want you to worry, but Also don't want you to be surprised if I need to reduce my activities for a while." Her words created a cold knot of fear in my stomach, though I tried to match her casual tone in my response. Grandma Rose had been the one constant source of love and support throughout my journey toward independence, and the possibility of losing her felt devastating. But I also knew that excessive worry wouldn't help either of us, and that the best thing I could do was continue pursuing the dreams she had encouraged while hoping that her health concerns would prove manageable. As my 4th year in the city drew to a close, I felt increasingly confident about the path I had chosen and the progress I was making toward my goals. My writing had reached a professional level, my financial situation was stable if not luxurious, and I had built a community of relationships that provided both personal fulfillment and professional support. The girl who had once been dismissed as the family disappointment had become a woman who was succeeding on her own terms, creating work that mattered and building a life that reflected her authentic values and interests. The rejection and disapproval that had once felt devastating now seemed irrelevant to my sense of self-worth and direction. I had learned to find validation through my own achievements and the respect of people who shared my values, rather than seeking approval from those who couldn't understand or appreciate my choices. The freedom to pursue meaningful work without compromise felt more valuable than any amount of family acceptance or financial security. But I also knew that my journey was far from complete. Publishing a novel, building a sustainable writing career, and establishing myself as a respected voice in literary fiction would require continued persistence and growth. The foundation I had built through years of sacrifice and hard work was strong, but there were still challenges ahead that would test my resolve and require new forms of courage and determination. The phone call came on a Thursday morning while I was reviewing page proofs for my 2nd novel, which was scheduled for publication in 6 months. My agent had just negotiated a contract for my 3rd book, and I was finally earning enough from my writing to quit the coffee shop and focus entirely on my literary career. The timing couldn't have been more ironic. "Sarah, dear," Grandma Rose's voice sounded weaker than I had ever heard it, barely above a whisper. "I need to tell you something important." I set down my pen and gave her my complete attention, though part of me already knew that whatever she was about to say would change everything. "What is it, Grandma? Are you feeling all right?" The pause that followed seemed to last forever. "The doctors found something during my tests last month. It's pancreatic cancer, sweetheart, and it's quite advanced. They're saying I have perhaps 3 to 6 months." The words hit me like a physical blow, knocking the breath from my lungs and making the room spin around me. Pancreatic cancer was essentially a death sentence, and advanced cases left little room for hope or miraculous recoveries. My grandmother, the one person who had believed in me unconditionally, who had supported my dreams when everyone else thought I was throwing my life away, was dying. "I'm coming home," I said immediately, already mentally packing and calculating train schedules. "I'll be there tonight." "No, dear," she said firmly, though I could hear the exhaustion beneath her determination. "You have your life there, your career that's finally taking off. I won't have you disrupting everything for an old woman who's had a wonderful, full life." "Grandma, you're not just an old woman," I protested, tears streaming down my face. "You're the most important person in my life. Nothing matters more than being with you right now." We argued gently for several minutes, with her insisting that I should continue my normal routine and me insisting that I needed to come home to help care for her. Finally, we reached a compromise. I would visit that weekend to assess the situation and help her make arrangements for whatever care she might need, but I wouldn't abandon my life in the city unless she specifically asked me to. The train ride home felt interminable, each mile carrying me back toward a childhood I had worked so hard to escape, but also toward the woman who had made that escape possible through her love and encouragement. The landscape outside the windows blurred past as I tried to process the reality that I was losing the one family member who had truly understood and supported me. Grandma Rose met me at the door of her Victorian mansion, and I was shocked by how much she had changed in the few months since her visit to the city. She had lost weight she couldn't afford to lose. Her skin had taken on a yellowish tinge that spoke of liver involvement, and she moved with the careful deliberation of someone managing significant pain. But her eyes were still bright with intelligence and affection, and her smile was as warm as ever. "Don't look at me like I'm already gone," she said, pulling me into a hug that felt more fragile than I remembered. "I'm still here, and I intend to make the most of whatever time I have left." We spent the weekend going through her affairs, a process that was both practically necessary and emotionally devastating. She had always been organized and forward-thinking, and she had already prepared most of the legal documents needed to handle her estate. What surprised me was discovering the extent of her financial resources, which were considerably larger than I had ever suspected. "I've been quite frugal over the years," she explained as we sat in her lawyer's office reviewing her will. "Your grandfather left me well provided for, and I've been careful with investments. I never spent much because I didn't need much, and I wanted to leave something meaningful for the people I love." The will itself contained several surprises that left me speechless. She had made generous donations to literacy organizations and local charities, established a scholarship fund for underprivileged students pursuing creative writing, and left substantial amounts to her church and the Historical Society. But the largest portion of her estate, including the Victorian house and the majority of her investments, was designated for me. "Grandma, this is too much," I protested after the lawyer finished reading the relevant sections. "I can't accept all of this." "You can, and you will," she replied with the firmness I remembered from childhood discussions about eating vegetables and doing homework. "You're the only one who truly understood what this house means, who appreciated its history and character. You're also the only one who chose authenticity over convenience, who had the courage to follow your dreams despite family pressure. This is my way of ensuring that you have the security to continue doing meaningful work without worrying about financial survival." The weekend passed too quickly, filled with conversations about practical matters mixed with deeper discussions about life, love, and the meaning we create through our choices. Grandma Rose was remarkably philosophical about her diagnosis, viewing it as a natural part of life's cycle rather than a cruel injustice. Her acceptance helped me begin processing my own grief while focusing on making her remaining time as comfortable and meaningful as possible. "I'm not afraid of dying," she told me as we sat on her porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. "I've lived exactly the life I wanted to live, loved the people I wanted to love, and seen you become the remarkable woman I always knew you could be. That's more than many people can say." When I returned to the city, I threw myself into my work with renewed intensity, partly as a distraction from my grief, and partly because I wanted to achieve as much as possible while Grandma Rose was still alive to share in my successes. My second novel was receiving positive advance reviews, and my publisher was optimistic about its commercial prospects. The book explored themes of family expectations and personal authenticity that felt especially relevant given my own experiences. I visited Grandma Rose every few weeks, watching helplessly as the cancer took its toll on her body while somehow leaving her spirit largely intact. She remained interested in my work and my life, asking detailed questions about my writing projects and the literary community I had joined. Even as she grew weaker, she insisted on hearing about my achievements and celebrating each small victory as if it were a major triumph. My family's response to Grandma Rose's illness was characteristically focused on practical rather than emotional concerns. My parents visited dutifully but briefly, more concerned with estate planning and medical decisions than with providing comfort or companionship. Caroline and Thomas made perfunctory appearances, fulfilling their obligations as grandchildren, while maintaining emotional distance that suggested they viewed her illness as an inconvenience rather than a tragedy. Their lack of genuine grief or connection with Grandma Rose made me even more protective of our relationship and more determined. to be present for her in ways they couldn't or wouldn't be. I became her primary companion during doctor's appointments, helped her manage her medications, and spent long hours simply sitting with her and talking about books, memories, and the changing seasons in her beloved garden. As her condition worsened, Grandma Rose began having more honest conversations about death and what would happen after she was gone. She worried about my relationship with the rest of the family, concerned that her bequest to me would create resentment and further strain our already tenuous connections. "They're going to be angry about the will," she said during one of our afternoon conversations in her sun-filled kitchen. "They'll think you manipulated me or that I wasn't thinking clearly. You need to be prepared for that reaction." "I don't care what they think," I replied, though even as I said it, I knew that wasn't entirely true. Despite years of building, independence, and emotional distance, the prospect of complete family rejection still carried power to hurt me. "I know you think you don't care," Grandma Rose said gently, "but family relationships are complicated. You may find that you want reconciliation more than you expect, especially after I'm gone. Just remember that their anger will be about their own disappointment and expectations, not about anything you've done wrong." Her insight proved prophetic in ways I couldn't have anticipated. As Grandma Rose's health declined more rapidly in her final months, my parents began making comments about her confused state and questioning whether she was competent to make financial decisions. They seemed particularly concerned about her plans to leave the family home to me, rather than selling it and dividing the proceeds among multiple beneficiaries. "It's not appropriate for Sarah to inherit the entire house," my mother said during one family conference about Grandma Rose's care. "That property has been in our family for generations. It should be preserved for everyone, not given to someone who's never shown any interest in family traditions." The accusation was so wrong, it was almost funny. I had been the only grandchild who regularly visited the house, who helped maintain the garden, who listened to family stories and preserved family photographs. But my parents seemed to believe that my geographical distance from home automatically disqualified me from understanding or appreciating family heritage. My father was more direct in his objections. "Your grandmother is not thinking clearly about the financial implications of her decisions. That house requires substantial maintenance and property taxes that someone in your position can't possibly afford. It would be more practical to sell it and divide the proceeds sensibly." What they meant, of course, was that I didn't deserve to inherit valuable family property because I had chosen an unconventional career path and rejected their definition of success. They couldn't imagine that my writing career had become financially viable, or that I might have developed the practical skills necessary to maintain a historic property. These conversations created tremendous stress for Grandma Rose, who was already struggling with pain management and the emotional challenges of terminal illness. She began expressing doubts about her estate planning, wondering if she should revise her will to avoid family conflict after her death. "Maybe your parents are right," she said during one particularly difficult day when her pain medication was making her unusually emotional. "Maybe I'm being selfish by giving you such a large responsibility. Maybe it would be better to divide everything equally and let the family decide together what to do with the house." "Grandma, this is your decision to make," I told her firmly. "You've earned the right to distribute your property according to your own values and wishes. Don't let anyone pressure you into changing your mind because they're uncomfortable with your choices." But I could see that the family pressure was wearing on her, adding emotional distress to her physical suffering. My parents' questions about her competency were particularly hurtful, suggesting that her love and support for me was evidence of diminished mental capacity rather than clear-eyed recognition of our special relationship. The situation reached a crisis point when my Uncle Robert, my father's brother, began discussing the possibility of having Grandma Rose declared incompetent so that the family could assume control of her finances and medical decisions. The suggestion was supposedly motivated by concern for her welfare, But it was clear that the real issue was ensuring that her estate was distributed according to family expectations rather than her personal preferences. "We need to protect her from making decisions she'll regret," Uncle Robert announced during a family meeting I attended reluctantly. "She's obviously not thinking clearly about the consequences of her actions. Someone needs to take responsibility for ensuring her affairs are handled appropriately." I was furious at the suggestion that Grandma Rose's love for me and faith in my abilities was evidence of mental illness. "She's been consistent about her estate planning for years," I pointed out. "Her decisions aren't impulsive or confused. They reflect her values and her assessment of which family members have earned her trust and support." The room fell silent at my direct challenge to the family narrative. Caroline looked shocked that I would speak so bluntly about family dynamics, while Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his chair. My parents exchanged the kind of meaningful glance that suggested they viewed my response as further evidence of my inappropriateness and selfishness. "Sarah," my mother said in her most condescending tone, "you're too emotionally involved to see this situation objectively. Your grandmother is dying, and she's not making rational decisions about her legacy. We need to think about what's best for everyone, not just what she wants in her current state." The implication that Grandma Rose's affection for me was a symptom of illness rather than a reasonable response to our relationship was so insulting that I had to leave the room to avoid saying something that would make family reconciliation impossible. I found myself standing in Grandma Rose's garden, surrounded by the flowers and vegetables we had planted together over so many years, trying to control my anger and hurt. Grandma Rose found me there an hour later, moving slowly but determinedly across the uneven ground with her walker. "I heard raised voices," she said, settling carefully onto the garden bench where we had shared so many important conversations. "I assume the family is discussing my mental competency again. They want to have you declared incompetent so they can control your estate," I said bluntly, seeing no point in protecting her from the truth. "Uncle Robert thinks you're not capable of making rational decisions about your property." Her laugh was weak but genuine. "Robert has always believed that anyone who disagrees with him must be mentally deficient. It's one of his least attractive qualities." She patted the bench beside her, inviting me to sit down. "I want you to know that I've spoken with my lawyer about this possibility. We've arranged for a psychiatric evaluation to document my mental competency, and I've videotaped a statement explaining my estate planning decisions. If anyone challenges my will, there will be substantial evidence that I was thinking clearly when I made these choices." Her foresight impressed me, though I was saddened that she had to take such precautions to protect her wishes from her own family. "Why are they so angry about me inheriting the house?" I asked. "It's not like any of them ever showed interest in preserving it or maintaining family traditions." "Because it represents something they can't control or understand," Grandma Rose replied. "Your success as a writer threatens their belief that only conventional careers provide security and respectability. If you can afford to maintain this house and build a meaningful life through creative work, it challenges everything they've taught their own children about what matters." She paused, looking out over the garden that had been her pride and joy for decades. "But there's something else, dear. Something I probably should have told you years ago." Her voice took on a more serious tone that immediately captured my attention. "What is it, Grandma?" "Your grandfather left specific instructions about this property in his will. He wanted it to go to whichever family member showed the greatest appreciation for its history and character, and the greatest commitment to preserving its integrity. When he died, your father was so focused on business expansion that he had no interest in an old house that would require ongoing maintenance and investment. This was the first I had heard about my grandfather's intentions regarding the family home. So Dad chose not to inherit it? He chose to let me maintain it with the understanding that I would eventually pass it on to someone who truly valued it. Over the years, it became clear that you were the only one who understood what this place meant, who spent time here, who helped preserve its gardens and traditions. Your grandfather would be proud to know that his instructions were ultimately fulfilled. The revelation added another layer of legitimacy to Grandma Rose's estate planning, though I doubted it would satisfy family members who were more interested in financial gain than historical preservation. It also helped me understand why my father's objections to my inheritance were particularly intense. He was essentially watching me receive something he had rejected years earlier but now viewed as valuable. As Grandma Rose's health continued to decline, I began spending longer periods at her house, officially taking a leave of absence from my city life to provide care and companionship during her final months. My publisher was understanding about the delayed timeline for my third novel, and my agent encouraged me to focus on family during this difficult period. The time I spent caring for Grandma Rose was both heartbreaking and precious. She retained her mental clarity even as her physical strength ebbed, allowing us to have deep conversations about life, death, and the legacy she hoped to leave. She shared family stories I had never heard, showed me photograph albums and documents that revealed our family's history in greater detail, and helped me understand the significance of the property I would inherit. This house has sheltered 4 generations of our family, she told me one afternoon as we sorted through old family papers in her study. It's seen births and deaths, celebrations and sorrows, prosperity and hardship. When you live here, you'll be part of that continuum, adding your own chapter to the story. The prospect of actually living in the Victorian mansion felt both exciting and overwhelming. The house was beautiful and historically significant, but it was also large, old, and expensive to maintain. I would need to learn about historical preservation, property management, and the kind of practical skills required to care for a century-old building. I'm scared I won't be able to take care of it properly, I admitted to Grandma Rose. What if I can't afford the maintenance costs? What if something major goes wrong and I don't know how to handle it? You'll learn, she said with characteristic confidence. The same determination that made you successful as a writer will help you become a good property owner. And you won't be doing it alone. There are contractors and specialists who understand historic homes, and there's money in the estate specifically designated for maintenance and improvements. Her practical preparations extended to every aspect of my future relationship with the property. She had compiled detailed records of past repairs and renovations, created lists of reliable contractors and service providers, and established accounts with local businesses that specialized in historic property maintenance. Even in her final months, she was thinking ahead to ensure my success. The family tensions around Grandma Rose's estate planning continued to simmer throughout her final months, occasionally erupting into uncomfortable confrontations that added stress to an already difficult situation. My parents and siblings seemed to view my presence at the house as evidence that I was manipulating a dying woman for financial gain, rather than recognizing that I was providing care and companionship during her last months of life. It's convenient how Sarah suddenly became so devoted when Grandma started talking about changing her will, Caroline remarked during one particularly tense family gathering. The accusation was so unfair that it took my breath away. I had been visiting Grandma Rose regularly for years, long before anyone knew about her estate plans. I've been coming here every few weeks for the past 5 years, I replied as calmly as I could manage. The only thing that's changed is that I'm spending more time here now because she's dying and needs care. But the damage was done. The family narrative had been established. I was the manipulative granddaughter who had taken advantage of an elderly woman's vulnerability to secure an undeserved inheritance. No amount of evidence about our long-standing relationship or my years of regular visits would alter that interpretation. Thomas attempted to be more diplomatic, but delivered essentially the same message. No one is questioning your motives, Sarah, but the optics are problematic. When the will is read, people are going to assume that your recent presence here influenced Grandma's decisions. It might be better if you took a step back and let the professional care providers handle her daily needs. The suggestion that I should abandon Grandma Rose during her final months to avoid appearing manipulative was so appalling that I couldn't even formulate a response. These people who had shown minimal interest in her well-being for years were now suggesting that my care and companionship was somehow inappropriate or suspicious. Grandma Rose was aware of these family dynamics and deeply troubled by them. "I hate that my death is creating conflict between you and your family," she said during one of our quiet evening conversations. "That was never my intention." "The conflict isn't your fault," I assured her. "They're angry because you're recognizing me for who I am rather than punishing me for who I'm not. They can't understand why someone would choose authenticity over approval, so they assume there must be some other explanation." As winter gave way to spring, Grandma Rose's condition deteriorated more rapidly. The cancer had spread extensively, and even with pain medication, she was experiencing significant discomfort that made sleeping and eating increasingly difficult. We began discussing hospice care and end-of-life decisions, conversations that were devastating but necessary. "I don't want to linger," she told me clearly during one of her better days. "When the time comes, I want to go peacefully, surrounded by people who love me, not hooked up to machines that are keeping my body alive after my spirit is ready to leave." We arranged for hospice services to begin providing support at the YE house, allowing her to remain in familiar surroundings rather than being transferred to a medical facility. The hospice workers were kind and professional, helping manage her symptoms while preserving her dignity and comfort during her final weeks. My family's visits became even more perfunctory during this period. Brief appearances that fulfilled their sense of obligation without providing meaningful emotional support. They seemed uncomfortable with the reality of death and dying, preferring to maintain emotional distance rather than engaging with the painful process of saying goodbye. I, on the other hand, felt privileged to be present during Grandma Rose's final weeks, to witness her grace and courage in facing death, and to provide whatever comfort and companionship I could during her transition. We spent hours together, in comfortable silence, sometimes talking about memories or current events, sometimes simply holding hands while she dozed. "Thank you for being here," she whispered during one of her last coherent conversations. "Thank you for choosing love over convenience, for staying true to yourself, and for giving an old woman the joy of watching you become everything she knew you could be." Grandma Rose died on a Tuesday morning in early June, peacefully in her sleep as she had hoped. I was with her when she passed, holding her hand and telling her how much she had meant to me, how grateful I was for her love and support, and how I would carry her memory with me always. The funeral arrangements brought the family together for the first time in months, and the forced proximity during a time of grief created additional tension around the unresolved estate issues. Everyone maintained appropriate public behavior during the service and burial, but the underlying conflicts were obvious to anyone who knew the family dynamics. Grandma Rose had planned her own funeral with characteristic thoughtfulness, choosing readings and music that reflected her values and beliefs. She had asked me to deliver a eulogy, an honor that I cherished despite my nervousness about speaking publicly during such an emotional time. Rose Mitchell was a woman who understood that love is measured not by conformity but by acceptance, I said from the pulpit, looking out at the gathered family and friends. She taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act according to your values despite that fear. She showed me that success isn't about meeting other people's expectations, but about becoming authentically yourself. The words felt inadequate to capture everything Grandma Rose had meant to me, but they were true to her memory and her values. Several people approached me after the service to share their own memories of her kindness and wisdom, stories that reinforced my sense of her as a woman who had made a positive difference in many lives. The will reading was scheduled for the following week, though everyone already knew the basic contents thanks to family discussions during Grandma Rose's illness. The formal reading was more a legal formality than a revelation, but it still carried emotional weight as the final closure to her life and the official beginning of new family dynamics. As the lawyer read through the various bequests and distributions, I watched my family's faces carefully. They maintained composed expressions during the charitable donations and smaller individual gifts, but their disapproval became more obvious as he reached the section detailing my inheritance of the house and the majority of the financial assets. When the reading concluded, the room fell into uncomfortable silence. Finally, my father cleared his throat and addressed the lawyer directly. "We'd like to discuss the possibility of challenging this will. There are questions about my mother's mental state during her final months that should be investigated." The lawyer, who had worked with Grandma Rose for many years, responded with professional calm. Mrs. Mitchell anticipated that possibility and took several precautions to document her mental competency. "We have a recent psychiatric evaluation, videotaped testimony explaining her decisions, and detailed records of her estate planning process, spanning several years. Any challenge would need to overcome substantial evidence that she was thinking clearly and acting according to her own free will." My Uncle Robert leaned forward aggressively. "There's also the question of undue influence. Sarah's increased presence during my mother's final months suggests possible manipulation of a vulnerable elderly person." "Again," the lawyer replied, "Mrs. Mitchell was aware of this potential allegation and prepared documentation showing that her estate planning decisions were made years before her illness, and that her relationship with Sarah was long-standing and genuine. She also left a letter specifically addressing these concerns." He handed me a sealed envelope with my name written in Grandma Rose's familiar handwriting. Inside was a letter that brought tears to my eyes, even as it provided the final proof of her wisdom and foresight. "My dear Sarah," the letter began, "if you're reading this, it means that someone has questioned my mental competency or suggested that you manipulated me for financial gain. I want you to know that every decision in my will was made with complete clarity and full knowledge of the consequences. You are receiving the largest portion of my estate because you are the only family member who loved me for who I was, rather than what I could provide, who chose authenticity over approval, and who had the courage to follow your dreams despite family pressure. You earned this inheritance through years of genuine relationship, not through manipulation or exploitation. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." The letter continued with specific examples of our relationship over the years, detailed explanations of her estate planning rationale, and expressions of pride in my accomplishments and character. It was both a legal document and a final declaration of love that left no doubt about her intentions or mental state. After the lawyer finished reading relevant portions of the letter aloud, my family sat in stunned silence. They had expected to find evidence supporting their narrative of manipulation and diminished capacity, but instead they were confronted with clear evidence of Grandma Rose's deliberate, well-reasoned decisions based on years of observation and relationship building. "This is preposterous," my mother finally said, her composure beginning to crack. "Sarah has always been the family disappointment, the one who rejected everything we tried to give her. Now she's being rewarded for that behavior with an inheritance. That should be shared among everyone." The words hung in the air like a slap, making explicit what had always been implied. I was the family disappointment, and my inheritance was seen as a perverse reward for failing to meet their expectations, rather than recognition for following my own path successfully. "Perhaps," I said quietly, standing to leave, "that tells you more about your expectations than about my worth." As I walked out of the lawyer's office, carrying the keys to my grandmother's house and the financial security to maintain it, I felt a complex mixture of grief, liberation, and anticipation. Grandma Rose's death had ended the most important relationship of my life, but her final gift had provided me with opportunities I could never have imagined when I first left home to pursue my writing dreams. The family disappointment had just inherited a fortune, a historic home, and the validation that at least one person had always believed in her potential. Now, I had to decide what to do with that unexpected power and how to honor the memory of the woman who had made it all possible. 3 years had passed since Grandma Rose's memorial garden party, and the Victorian mansion had become more than just my home. It had transformed into a thriving cultural center that hosted literary, workshops, art exhibitions, and community events that drew visitors from across the region. The house that my family had once dismissed as an expensive burden had become a source of both personal fulfillment and modest income through educational programs and venue rentals. My writing career had flourished beyond anything I had dared to imagine during those uncertain early years in the city. My 4th novel had become a bestseller, earning me recognition as one of the most promising voices in contemporary literary fiction. The success had brought opportunities I never could have anticipated: teaching positions at prestigious universities, speaking engagements at international literary festivals, and film options for several of my books. But it was a Tuesday morning, in November, when the phone call came that would test everything I had built and force me to confront the true extent of my transformation from family disappointment to independent success. "Sarah, this is Margaret Stevens from Pinnacle Legal Associates." The voice on the other end was professionally crisp, but carried an undertone of urgency that immediately captured my attention. "I'm calling regarding your father's business affairs. Are you available to meet this afternoon? There's a time-sensitive situation that requires immediate family input." I hadn't spoken to my father in over 2 years, not since his failed attempt to pressure me into selling the Victorian house. The idea that his business affairs would require my input seemed absurd, given his long-standing dismissal of my judgment and capabilities. "I'm not sure I understand," I replied carefully. "My father and I don't have any business relationships, and I'm not involved in family financial matters. Perhaps you should contact my brother Thomas instead." There was a pause before Margaret Stevens continued, her tone becoming even more serious. "Ms. Mitchell, I'm afraid your brother is part of the problem we need to discuss. Could you meet me at our downtown office at 3 o'clock? This involves significant financial irregularities that could affect the entire family, and frankly, you may be the only family member in a position to help resolve the situation." The cryptic nature of her request was deeply unsettling, but my curiosity overcame my reluctance to become involved in family business affairs. I agreed to the meeting, spending the intervening hours wondering what kind of crisis could possibly require my involvement after years of family estrangement. The law office occupied several floors of a gleaming downtown tower, its polished marble lobby and expensive artwork projecting exactly the kind of success and respectability that my family had always valued. Margaret Stevens turned out to be a woman in her 50s with silver hair and the kind of composed demeanor that suggested extensive experience handling delicate family situations. "Thank you for coming on such short notice," she began as we settled into her spacious conference room. "I'll be direct because time is a critical factor. Your father's company is facing a federal investigation for financial fraud, and preliminary evidence suggests that your brother Thomas was the primary architect of the illegal schemes." The words hit me like a physical blow. Thomas, the golden child who had been groomed for business success since childhood, was apparently facing criminal charges that could destroy not only his own future, but the family company that had been my father's life's work. "The investigation began 6 months ago," Margaret continued, opening a thick file of documents. "It appears that Thomas created a series of shell companies to inflate property values and hide loan defaults. The scheme allowed the company to secure financing based on fraudulent asset valuations while concealing significant losses from previous development projects." She handed me a summary sheet that outlined the scope of the alleged fraud. The numbers were staggering: millions of dollars in fake transactions, dozens of properties with inflated appraisals, and a complex web of financial manipulations that had apparently been years in the making. "How much does my father know about this?" I asked, trying to process the implications of what I was hearing. "That's unclear," Margaret admitted. "Your father claims he trusted Thomas to handle the financial details while he focused on client relationships, and project development. But federal investigators are skeptical that the company president could be completely unaware of such extensive fraud occurring under his supervision. The situation was even worse than I had initially understood. Both my father and Thomas were potentially facing criminal charges. The family company was likely to be dissolved or seized by federal authorities, and decades of built wealth and reputation were about to disappear in a scandal that would make headlines across the region. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect the answer. Margaret's expression grew even more serious. "Because your family's legal bills are going to be enormous, and your father's assets are likely to be frozen as part of the investigation. Your mother's financial security, your father's ability to mount an effective legal defense, and your family's basic survival may depend on external resources that aren't subject to federal seizure." The implication was clear. My inheritance from Grandma Rose, which the family had once tried to claim was undeserved and improperly obtained, had suddenly become their potential salvation. The money they had scorned was now the only resource that might save them from financial ruin and criminal prosecution. "They want me to help them," I said flatly, understanding the full irony of the situation. "Your father is too proud to ask." "Directly," Margaret confirmed. "But yes, the family needs financial assistance, and you're the only one with liquid assets that aren't connected to the business or subject to investigation." I spent the next hour learning additional details about the investigation and the family's legal exposure. Thomas had apparently been living far beyond his means, using company funds to support an extravagant lifestyle that included expensive cars, luxury vacations, and a house that cost twice what his legitimate salary could support. When questioned about these expenditures, he had created increasingly elaborate financial schemes to hide the theft and justify his apparent wealth. My father's role was more ambiguous, but potentially no less serious. Even if he hadn't actively participated in the fraud, his failure to exercise proper oversight as company president could result in criminal negligence charges. His reputation in the business community was already destroyed, and his professional relationships were evaporating as news of the investigation spread. "What specifically are they asking me to do?" I inquired as our meeting drew to a close. "Initially, they need help with legal fees," Margaret explained. "The criminal defense attorneys alone will cost several $100,000, and that's before considering potential civil liability or restitution payments. Beyond that, your parents may need basic financial support since their assets are likely to be frozen pending resolution of the investigation." The request was enormous in scope and would require me to risk substantial portions of my inheritance to help family members who had rejected and belittled me for years. There was no guarantee that any money I provided would be recovered, and involving myself in their legal problems could potentially expose me to scrutiny or complications I had done nothing to deserve. "I need time to consider this," I told Margaret. "This is obviously a complex situation with serious implications for everyone involved." She nodded understandingly. "Of course, but I should mention that time is a critical factor. The federal investigation is moving quickly, and delays in securing adequate legal representation could significantly worsen the eventual outcomes for everyone." I drove home through the late afternoon traffic, my mind reeling with the implications of what I had learned. The family that had dismissed me as a disappointment, that had questioned my judgment and capabilities, that had accused me of manipulating a dying woman for financial gain, was now facing a crisis that could only be resolved through my assistance. The irony was so complete it was almost surreal. The inheritance they had tried to claim was fraudulently obtained had suddenly become their only hope for avoiding financial and legal catastrophe. The granddaughter they had written off as a failure had become their potential savior, the one person with the resources and independence to help them survive the consequences of their own poor decisions. That evening, as I sat in Grandma Rose's library surrounded by the books and photographs that had provided comfort during so many difficult periods, I tried to imagine what she would have advised me to do in this situation. Her values had always emphasized family loyalty and forgiveness, but they had also included personal responsibility and the importance of learning from mistakes. The decision was further complicated by my evolving relationships with Caroline and Thomas. Over the past 3 years, Caroline had made genuine efforts to rebuild our connection, visiting regularly and demonstrating real interest in my work and life. Our relationship wasn't perfect, but it was more authentic and respectful than it had ever been during our childhood. Thomas, on the other hand, had remained more distant. While he had attended the memorial garden party and made some acknowledgement of his previous errors in judgment, our relationship had never progressed beyond polite civility. His apparent role as the primary architect of the family's current crisis made me question whether his limited efforts at reconciliation had been motivated by genuine remorse or by some awareness that he might eventually need my help. I called Caroline that evening, needing to hear her perspective on the situation before making any decisions about how to respond to the family's crisis. "I was wondering when you'd find out," she said as soon as I mentioned the legal meeting. "I've known about the investigation for weeks, but Dad made me promise not to contact you about it." "How bad is it really?" I asked, hoping she might have information that would help me understand the full scope of the problem. Caroline's sigh was audible through the phone. "It's worse than whatever the lawyers told you. Thomas has been stealing from the company for at least 5 years, maybe longer. He's been living like he was already inheriting millions while actually draining the business of working capital." She paused, and I could hear the pain in her voice as she continued. "The worst part is that Dad probably did know something was wrong, but he didn't want to confront Thomas because admitting his son was a criminal would have destroyed his image of himself as a successful patriarch who had raised successful children." The family dynamics Caroline described were sadly consistent with patterns I had observed throughout our childhood. Thomas had always been protected from the consequences of his mistakes, while the rest of us were held to higher standards of accountability and responsibility. "What do you think I should do?" I asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. "Honestly, part of me thinks you should let them face the consequences of their own choices," Caroline replied. "They treated you terribly when Grandma Rose left you the inheritance, and now they want your help when it's convenient for them." She paused again, and when she continued, her tone was more thoughtful. "But part of me also thinks that helping them might be the kind of grace that Grandma Rose would have shown. She always believed in second chances and family loyalty, even when the family didn't deserve it." Caroline's conflicted response mirrored my own feelings about the situation. The desire for justice wanted me to let my family face the full consequences of their actions and attitudes. But the values Grandma Rose had instilled in me emphasized compassion and forgiveness, even toward people who had caused hurt and disappointment. Over the next few days, I found myself conducting what amounted to an informal investigation into the family's situation. I spoke with former business associates who confirmed that the company had been showing signs of financial stress for several years. I researched the federal prosecutors handling the case and learned that they had a reputation for aggressive pursuit of white-collar crime. I even hired my own attorney to assess the legal implications of providing financial assistance to family members under federal investigation. The picture that emerged was grim, but not hopeless. Thomas was almost certainly facing significant prison time and would never again be able to work in any position requiring financial responsibility. My father's future was more uncertain. He might avoid criminal charges if he could demonstrate that he had been deceived by Thomas rather than actively participating in the fraud. But regardless of the criminal outcomes, the family's financial situation was catastrophic. The business would be dissolved, their assets would be seized or frozen, and my parents would face old age with virtually no resources for basic living expenses, let alone the kind of comfortable retirement they had planned. The attorney I consulted advised me that providing financial assistance would be legal, as long as it wasn't used to hide assets or obstruct the investigation. However, He also warned that any money I provided would likely be scrutinized by federal investigators and could potentially be claimed as restitution if the government decided it represented proceeds of the fraudulent activities. You need to understand that you could lose everything you invest in their legal defense, he told me bluntly. And there's no guarantee that helping them will result in better outcomes for anyone involved. His warning was sobering, but it also clarified the nature of the decision I was facing. This wasn't really about financial calculations or legal strategies. It was about what kind of person I wanted to be and what values I wanted to honor in my response to family crisis. The breakthrough in my thinking came during a visit to Grandma Rose's grave on the 3-year anniversary of her death. I had established a tradition of bringing flowers from her garden and spending quiet time reflecting on the lessons she had taught me about life, love, and family relationships. As I arranged white roses on her gravestone, I found myself having an imaginary conversation with her about the current family crisis. What would she want me to do? How would she balance her values of family loyalty and personal responsibility? What kind of response would honor her memory while remaining true to my own growth and independence? The answer that emerged felt both surprising and inevitable. Grandma Rose would have helped the family, not because they deserved it, but because helping others in crisis was the right thing to do regardless of their previous behavior. But she would have helped on her own terms, with conditions that reflected her values and expectations rather than simply enabling continued irresponsibility. I called Margaret Stevens the next morning with my decision. I'm willing to provide financial assistance for my family's legal defense, I told her, but I have specific conditions that must be met before any money changes hands. She was clearly relieved by my willingness to help, though cautious about the conditions I intended to impose. What kind of conditions are you considering? First, I want complete financial transparency from my father and Thomas. I need to see all business records, personal financial statements, and evidence of how company funds were used. If I'm going to risk my money, I need to understand exactly what I'm paying for. Margaret agreed that this was reasonable, though she warned that gathering such comprehensive documentation might take several weeks. Second, I continued, I want written acknowledgments from my father that his previous treatment of me was unfair and that his assessment of my judgment and capabilities was wrong. I'm not interested in groveling or excessive apologies, but I need recognition that the family's attitude toward me has been based on prejudice rather than facts. This condition was more personal than practical, but it felt essential for my own emotional well-being. If I was going to save my family from the consequences of their poor decisions, I needed acknowledgement that their poor treatment of me had been unjustified. Finally, I said, I want assurance that Thomas will accept responsibility for his actions and cooperate fully with the federal investigation. I won't provide money to help someone avoid accountability for criminal behavior. Margaret agreed to present my conditions to the family and provide their response within a week. The waiting period was tense, filled with uncertainty about whether my family's pride would allow them to accept help that came with requirements for honesty and accountability. The answer came not from Margaret Stevens, but from my father himself, who called me directly for the first time in over 3 years. Sarah. His voice was subdued, lacking the authoritative tone that had characterized our previous conversations. I understand you're willing to help with our legal expenses, and I want you to know how grateful we are for your consideration. The conversation that followed was unlike any we had ever had. My father acknowledged that he had been wrong about my capabilities and judgment, that his treatment of me had been unfair and based on narrow definitions of success that didn't account for my actual achievements. I was so focused on conventional markers of success that I couldn't see the value in what you were building, he admitted. Your grandmother saw something in you that I missed, and her faith in your abilities has been proven right in ways I never expected. His admission was more complete than I had dared to hope for, and it opened the door to a level of honesty in our relationship that had never existed before. He shared details about the business problems that had developed over the past several years, his own feelings of failure as both a father and a businessman, and his regrets about the choices that had led to the current crisis. Thomas has agreed to cooperate fully with the investigation, he told me. He knows he's going to prison, and he's finally ready to take responsibility for what he's done. He's also agreed to testify against any co-conspirators and help the government recover as much money as possible. The family's acceptance of my conditions felt like more than just agreement to my terms for financial assistance. It represented a fundamental shift in our relationship dynamics. For the first time in my life, my family was acknowledging my authority and judgment, recognizing that my success and independence had given me both the resources and the wisdom to help them navigate their crisis. Over the following months, I provided substantial financial support for the family's legal defense while maintaining careful oversight of how the money was used. The process was emotionally exhausting and financially risky, but it also provided opportunities for rebuilding family relationships on more authentic and respectful foundations. Thomas ultimately pleaded guilty to multiple fraud charges and was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison. His cooperation with the investigation helped reduce his sentence and enabled the government to recover some of the stolen funds. My father avoided criminal charges but was barred from holding executive positions in publicly traded companies, effectively ending his business career. The financial cost of the legal defense was enormous, over $500,000 that I will likely never recover. But the emotional and relational benefits were worth far more than the monetary expense. My father's acknowledgement of his previous errors in judgment had created space for a more honest and respectful relationship. Caroline's gratitude for my willingness to help the family, despite their previous treatment, had deepened our connection and mutual respect. Even my mother, who had been largely absent from our family drama, reached out to thank me and to acknowledge that she had been wrong to dismiss my achievements and life choices. "I always thought you were being stubborn and impractical," she told me during one of our first meaningful conversations in decades. "But you were actually being brave and authentic, and that's made all the difference in your life." The aftermath of the family crisis also brought unexpected changes to my living situation and future plans. My parents, who had lost their home as part of the federal seizure of assets, needed somewhere to live during their difficult transition to a much more modest lifestyle. After considerable discussion and negotiation, we agreed that they could move into the guest wing of the Victorian mansion while they rebuilt their lives. The arrangement was temporary and came with clear boundaries about autonomy and decision-making, but it also provided opportunities for daily interaction that gradually helped heal some of the wounds from our difficult family history. My father, no longer burdened by the pressures of running a business or maintaining his community status, revealed aspects of his personality that were more relaxed and genuine than anything I had seen during my childhood. My mother, freed from the social obligations that had consumed so much of her energy, discovered interests in gardening and local history that created natural opportunities for shared activities and conversation. She became particularly helpful with the historical research I was conducting for a nonfiction book about Victorian architecture and family preservation. The most surprising development was how much I enjoyed having family members living in the house that had once been my private sanctuary. The building was large enough to provide privacy and independence for everyone, but it also facilitated the kind of informal daily interactions that had been absent from our relationships for years. Thomas's imprisonment was devastating for the entire family, but it also forced all of us to confront the enabling patterns and denial that had contributed to his criminal behavior. Family therapy sessions, which had been a condition of my financial support, helped us develop more honest communication patterns and healthier boundaries around accountability and consequences. As the 5th anniversary of Grandma Rose's death approached, I found myself reflecting on how completely my life had changed since inheriting her legacy. The Victorian house had become not just a home, but a center for community cultural activities, family reconciliation, and historic preservation that honored her memory while serving contemporary needs. My writing career had reached heights I never could have imagined, with my latest novel earning both critical acclaim and commercial success that provided financial security for years to come. More importantly, my work had found its authentic voice, drawing on themes of family, forgiveness, and the courage required to choose love over resentment. The memorial garden party that year was the largest yet, with over 100 guests celebrating Grandma Rose's legacy and the positive changes that had emerged from even the darkest periods of family crisis. My parents attended, along with Caroline, and several family friends who had supported us through the difficult legal proceedings. Thomas was still in prison and would not be eligible for parole for another year, but he had written a letter that Caroline read aloud during the memorial program. In it, he acknowledged the pain his actions had caused the family and expressed gratitude for the second chances that my support had made possible. I spent years thinking that success meant accumulating money and status, his letter stated. But watching Sarah's response to our family crisis has taught me that real success means having the character to help others, even when they don't deserve it, and the wisdom to build something meaningful that serves purposes larger than yourself. As the evening concluded and guests began to depart, I found myself standing in the same spot in Grandma Rose's garden, where I had experienced so many moments of clarity and decision over the years. The roses were blooming magnificently, their fragrance filling the air with sweetness that reminded me of her presence and her continuing influence on my choices. My father approached as I was deadheading spent blooms, a task that had become a meditative ritual connecting me to both the garden's beauty and its need for ongoing care. "I owe you more than I can ever repay," he said quietly, his voice carrying emotion that would have been unthinkable during the proud, distant years of my childhood. Not just for the money, though that saved us from financial ruin, but for showing me what grace looks like when it's offered by someone who has every right to withhold it. His words captured something essential about the transformation that had occurred in our family relationships. The crisis that had initially seemed like a devastating reversal of our growing stability had actually become an opportunity for deeper, healing, and more authentic connection than we had ever achieved during the supposedly successful years of my childhood. Grandma Rose always said that families aren't perfect, but they're worth preserving when there's genuine love underneath the dysfunction, I replied. I think she would be proud that we found our way back to each other, even if it took a crisis to get there. The evening air filled with the sound of night birds and the distant laughter of neighbors, creating a peaceful backdrop for reflection on how far we had all traveled from the painful family dynamics that had defined my early years. The girl who had once been dismissed as the family disappointment had become the anchor that held everyone together during their darkest period. But more than that, I had learned that true success wasn't about proving my family wrong or gaining power over people who had hurt me. It was about becoming the kind of person who could offer help without conditions, forgiveness without bitterness, and love without guarantees of reciprocation. Standing in Grandma Rose's garden as darkness settled, over the Victorian mansion that had become my family's refuge and renewal, I felt her presence more strongly than I had since her death. She had given me not just financial security and a beautiful home, but the opportunity to discover what I was truly capable of when I stopped seeking approval and started living from authentic values. The inheritance she had left me wasn't really about money or property. It was about the freedom to choose who I wanted to become and the resources to honor that choice regardless of others' expectations or limitations. The family disappointment had become the family's salvation, but more importantly, she had become herself, fully and without apology. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.